Sealed deep in the Venezuelan jungle, a fortress once thought untouchable has already swallowed entire U.S. special ops teams. Now, for the second time in history, a B-2 spirit has unleashed the mother of all bombs against it. But the real shock isn't the size of the blast, it's what the strike awakened. Fractured cartels scattering like shadows, plotting in silence, and preparing a retaliation that could spread far beyond Venezuela's borders. Now, let's pull back the curtain on the moment that changed everything.
And now we'll look at cartels. We're going to look very seriously at cartels.
Nicolas Maduro is an indicted drug trafficker.
I announced $50 million reward for his capture.
The ghost fighter takes flight. When the United States unleashed the B-2 spirit over Venezuela, the blast that tore through Tren de Guayana's jungle strongholds seemed like the end of a cartel empire. But as the smoke thinned, a colder truth emerged. The strike may not have ended the threat at all. It may have scattered it, awakening hidden networks, emboldening dark alliances, and setting in motion a chain of retaliation that could reach far beyond Venezuela's borders.
But that doesn't explain how it actually lands with the employees in these various agencies, or what legal authority they have to take some of the actions that they're trying to put in motion.
But to understand how it got there, we have to go back to the launch. No one outside the highest U.S. security circles knew the order had been signed. There was no public announcement or breaking news. But in the early hours of a moonless night, a signal left the Oval Office and flashed to a hangar in Missouri. Inside, a single B-2 Spirit bomber rolled out of its shelter. There was no roar or fanfare, just the low hum of a machine built to cross continents unseen. Its mission was clear: penetrate Venezuelan airspace and strike a fortress that had already swallowed the best special operations teams sent against it. The choice of aircraft wasn't symbolic. The B-2 was designed in the 1980s to slip past Soviet radar and hit hardened silos without warning. Decades later, it remains one of the few aircraft able to evade modern detection. Its radar-absorbing skin and blended wing shape scatter or absorb incoming signals, often leaving even advanced systems with nothing more than a flicker on a screen. That invisibility made it the only realistic option. Venezuela's aging air defenses, the S-300 batteries and MiG-29 fighters, still posed enough of a threat to down a conventional bomber. Sending one of those would mean risking another disaster like the failed ground raids. The B-2 could fly in low, hugging terrain, map the jungle with onboard synthetic aperture radar, and release its payload with GPS accuracy before slipping away unseen.
That has for so long stood as a sanctuary city or safe for immigrants, he now, after several years of frustration with the Biden administration,
its track record reassured planners. The same aircraft had delivered devastating strikes during the Gulf War in 1991, taking out a third of Iraq's air defense network in a single opening pass. In spring 2025, it had flown 18-hour sorties in Operation Midnight Hammer, breaching Iran's underground nuclear facilities with massive ordnance penetrators, without being intercepted or even detected in time. For the cartel fortress, the B-2 would carry a mix of precision-guided munitions, cluster bombs for surface defenses, and deeper penetrating weapons for the bunkers. The plan was to neutralize the compound's outer rings first, then collapse its underground network before reinforcements could scatter. But the mission raised alarms in Washington. The target lay close to villages forced into the cartel's orbit, and a strike risked civilian casualties. Some advisors worried it could be seen as an attack on Venezuela's leadership itself, provoking an unpredictable military response. The debate between advocates of decisive action and those urging restraint stretched for days, even as field intelligence warned that the fortress was expanding and fortifying further. In the end, the decision was made under mounting pressure, rising overdose deaths in the United States, and growing evidence of cartel infiltration across borders. Once the signal went out, there was no turning back. And as the black wing of the spirit cut through the last stretch of night toward Venezuela, one question haunted everyone who knew what was coming. What sort of enemy could force the world's most advanced stealth bomber into action against a cartel? To answer that, we need to go back to the shadow empire that rose from inside a prison and spread across a continent. The cartel empire no one saw coming. Nobody can say exactly when it began, only that by the time the world noticed, it was already too late. Deep inside Venezuela's Tacaran prison, long before U.S. drones circled the jungles, a gang was quietly building something far bigger than a prison racket. Tren de Aragua started as a handful of inmates smuggling cell phones, weapons, and drugs past guards willing to look away for a cut. By the mid-2000s, they were no longer just surviving prison life, they were organizing an empire. When Venezuela's economy collapsed in 2017, the gang found its opening. Hyperinflation shredded wages, food vanished from store shelves, and ordinary people, cops, clerks, and even soldiers, either joined them or paid for protection. What began as petty extortion in poor neighborhoods grew into a criminal pipeline stretching beyond Venezuela's borders. By 2020, Tren de Aragua had hundreds of members, many tattooed with their gang symbols, spreading from the barrios into neighboring Colombia and Brazil. They seized control of smuggling routes along the Orinoco River and began moving hard drugs in bulk. They taxed migrant caravans crossing the Darien Gap and used the profits to buy assault rifles from black market arms dealers. The U.S. law enforcement agencies started finding their fingerprints on fentanyl-laced hitting American streets, and overdose rates in border states spiked by nearly 40%. But Tren de Aragua did not rise alone. Behind them stood powerful allies inside Venezuela's own government. The Cartel of the Suns, a network of military officers and officials, had for years moved hard using state aircraft and diplomatic cover. Their cooperation gave Tren protection and access to global smuggling routes. The cash they funneled back into state accounts helped keep the Maduro regime afloat, despite sanctions and economic collapse. By early 2025, this alliance had turned Venezuela into a narco state. Checkpoints on jungle highways became toll booths for smugglers. Army officers used their rank to shield shipments. Profits from the drug trade fed corruption at every level of government and strengthened ties to FARC splinter groups and even overseas terror networks looking for ways to launder money. For Washington, the threat was no longer distant. Tren de Aragua's reach extended into U.S. cities, where their affiliates laundered cash through real estate deals and pushed deadly street drugs. Intelligence reports warned that their networks were linked to violence against political leaders in Colombia and to corruption in airports as far away as New York. U.S. officials estimated as many as 100,000 American deaths from overdoses by the end of the year, numbers that made inaction no longer an option. But striking back meant confronting a force that was no longer just a gang. It was a state within a state, protected by generals and hidden behind jungle walls. To understand why every previous assault had failed, you have to step into the green heart of their power, an unmarked patch of forest where even satellites see only trees. The cartel's jungle fortress. Somewhere deep in Venezuela's Guayana Shield, satellite images show nothing but endless green. Yet every U.S. task force sent near this patch of jungle has come back in body bags or not at all. Hidden under that canopy is a stronghold the Tren de Aragua built into the land itself. Part fortress, part factory, part trap. The perimeter looks harmless from the air, a few decaying huts and a dirt strip that could pass for an abandoned logging site. On the ground, it is something else entirely, rings of hidden claymore mines and tripwired approaches that have shredded entire advance teams before they even saw the real compound. Under the surface, the cartel's engineers dug a network of tunnels 30 feet down, using cheap labor from coerced miners and reinforcing the passages with scavenged steel. Every access shaft is booby-trapped, pressure-plated to explosives that can erase a squad in seconds. Inside these tunnels sit workshops that churn out industrial-grade fentanyl and cocaine paste bound for the United States. Around them, sealed bunkers hold crates of rifles, belts of Dragunov sniper rounds, and Iranian-made man-portable air defense launchers, the same weapons that brought down a Colombian helicopter in 2023. Solar panels camouflaged under layers of vines feed power to encrypted radios and a server room inside a Faraday-caged vault, keeping the cartel's ledgers beyond the reach of cyber forensics. But the fortress is not just steel and concrete. The cartel has forced several Yanomami families to live at the edges of the compound, their villages ringed with razor wire. To strike the fortress means risking those lives, a fact that has paralyzed more than one rescue plan and turned every potential raid into a public relations gamble. The fortress is guarded day and night by more than 250 armed men, organized into rotating patrols that know the trails and the terrain better than any outside force. Their ears are tuned to the faintest drone hum. Jammers hidden in the tree line have repeatedly knocked U.S. and Colombian surveillance drones out of the sky. The record of failed assaults has made the place notorious. In mid-2023, a U.S. Delta team tried a night insertion by helicopter, but was hit by a missile on approach, leaving survivors to retreat through the jungle without their target. In 2024, a joint Colombian-U.S. force lost 22 men after being funneled by hidden tripwires into punji pit kill zones. Even drone strikes proved useless. Their guidance scrambled before they could lock on target. By late 2024, military planners admitted that conventional raids were suicide. Boots meant casualties, drones were blind, and every delay let the fortress expand. In that stalemate, the debate shifted from how to attack to a darker question. What kind of weapon would it take to break a fortress that had already buried so many? The answer would be chosen far from the jungle, in a sealed room beneath the Pentagon. Hit the like button to show your support as this high-stakes battle against the fortress unfolds. Inside the command room, the decision to strike. No one outside that underground chamber in the Pentagon knew that a single decision was about to redraw the line between counter-narcotics and open war. Somewhere in that silence, the debate shifted from how to stop the cartel to whether to unleash a weapon that hadn't been used on this scale in years. For weeks, intelligence reports had warned that Tren de Aragua was shifting its supply routes inland after U.S. Navy and carrier-based jets sank several fentanyl-laden speedboats off Venezuela's coast in late August. Defectors captured in Panama confirmed what the analysts feared. The fortress was stockpiling for an even larger production surge. On the table lay a memo signed by President Trump in July. The order, blunt and brief, authorized all necessary measures to disrupt cartel operations. Until now, that had meant maritime strikes, but the flow of drugs into U.S. cities had not slowed, and deaths from fentanyl overdoses had passed 50,000 the previous year. Joint Chiefs pushed for decisive air action, insisting that previous ground raids had failed and would fail again. Diplomats from the State Department hesitated. They warned that a strike deep inside Venezuela risked igniting a regional backlash, destabilizing fragile relations with Colombia and Brazil. Human rights advisors added another layer of caution, showing estimates of civilian presence near the target zones, mostly indigenous Yanomami families forced by the cartel to live near their defenses. A miscalculation could spark an international uproar. For days, the argument circled. Drone strikes were dismissed as too vulnerable to the fortress's jammers. A ground assault was deemed too costly after the disastrous Delta and FARC operations of 2023 and 2024. The B-2 Spirit emerged as the only option that could strike fast and deep while minimizing exposure and risk to U.S. forces. The final decision came late on a Thursday night. The president's voice came over a secure line, flat and firm. Make it count, but keep it ours. The tension in the room broke only slightly. Orders went out to Whiteman Air Force Base, where the bomber was already being readied. Everyone in the chamber knew the green light would not just launch a strike, it would test how far Washington was willing to go in this new kind of war. When that decision was finally made, the world still slept, unaware that a single launch order had just shifted the fight against cartels into territory not seen since the Cold War. The first glimpse the public would get came not in the jungle, but on the open sea. Unleashing the mother of all bombs, a strike that changed the game. On the morning of September 2nd, 2025, Americans awoke to a jarring announcement. From the White House podium, President Trump revealed that a U.S. Navy aircraft had struck a Venezuelan-flagged speedboat in the southern Caribbean the day before, killing all 11 people on board. Hours later, he posted the grainy infrared video himself, a single white flare leaping from sea to sky as the vessel erupted in fire. The administration said the boat belonged to Tren de Aragua, the Venezuelan gang it now labels a narco-terrorist organization. Officials claimed it was ferrying a major load of narcotics north toward the islands and ultimately to U.S. shores. They offered no proof that the boat carried weapons, only the president's blunt declaration that it had been loaded. The attack came at a moment when U.S.-Venezuelan tensions were already climbing. Just 2 weeks earlier, Washington had deployed 3 warships and roughly 4,000 sailors and Marines to the region, promising to choke off the flow of fentanyl and other illicit drugs. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth hailed the strike as the opening shot in a broader campaign, while Secretary of State Marco Rubio warned, "It'll happen again." On Venezuela's coast, the mood was different. In the fishing village of San Juan de Unare, long notorious as a smuggling hub, mourners posted the faces of the dead online within hours. 8 were from the village, 3 from a nearby town. The speedboat, a narrow 12-meter flipper, powered by 4 outboard engines, had been bound for Trinidad and Tobago when U.S. forces intercepted it at sea. Witnesses claimed it turned back just before the missile struck. The strike did not stand alone. In the weeks that followed, U.S. forces hit 3 more suspected smuggling boats in the Caribbean. One joint operation with the Dominican Navy recovered more than a ton of cocaine from the wreckage. Trump responded online in all caps, "Be warned, if you are transporting drugs that kill Americans, we are hunting you." For supporters, it was a decisive move against traffickers. For opponents, it marked a chilling precedent. Lethal force delivered far from U.S. shores without judicial review, hinting at a conflict sliding from law enforcement into undeclared war. What no one yet realized was that the missile's blast on that boat had struck more than its target. It had shaken the fragile balance between nations, and the political shockwave was about to circle the globe. The next battles would be fought not on the water, but in parliaments, on the streets of Caracas, and in the halls of the United Nations. Share this story with your friends to let them see just how high the stakes have risen in this unfolding conflict. Global shockwaves and diplomatic fallout. No one could say, in the first hours after the strike, what would ripple out faster, the shockwave in the jungle or the political firestorm it lit across the world. When dawn broke over Caracas on the 3rd of September, the streets were already stirring with grief. Tributes to the dead, faces, names, grainy phone clips of a burning boat flooded Venezuelan social media. For 4 uneasy hours, the Maduro government stayed silent. The first word came not from the president, but from Communications Minister Freddy Ñañez, who dismissed the U.S. video of the strike as fabricated. In San Juan de Unare, the fishing town that lost 8 of its own, residents called it a lie. That night, on live television, Interior Minister Diosdado Cabello leaned into the government's counter-narrative. He branded the strike fake news, an American stunt to mask a push for regime change, and called the deaths extrajudicial murders. Days later, Attorney General Tarek William Saab went further, insisting the attack had never happened at all. But as officials denied, locals in the villages near the Paria Peninsula posted photos of funerals and accused Caracas of hiding the truth. By the week's end, Maduro broke his silence with a warning that Washington's naval buildup and cross-border strike were meant to topple his government, not to curb narcotics. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez mocked the American claim that the target was cartel-linked. How can there be a cartel if there are no drugs here? Cabello escalated the rhetoric, accusing the US DEA of staging a false flag operation. In Washington, the argument turned bitter in public. Former NATO commander James Stavridis called the operation a show of gunboat diplomacy, hinting that Venezuelan oil, not might be the real trigger. On X, Vice President J.D. Vance declared that killing cartel members was the highest and best use of our military, prompting writer Brian Krasenstein to fire back that killing foreign civilians without trial is a war crime. Senator Rand Paul condemned that stance as despicable, only to be rebuked by Senator Bernie Moreno, who blamed traffickers for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Americans. The backlash reached Capitol Hill. Senator Mark Warner, on the Intelligence Committee's elite gang of 8, warned that the strike risked putting U.S. forces in harm's way by violating international law, and admitted Congress had not been briefed. A bipartisan security hearing set for the 5th of September was abruptly canceled, deepening the sense that even Washington was scrambling to contain the fallout. Abroad, the hemisphere itself seemed to split. Puerto Rico's governor and Trinidad and Tobago's prime minister applauded the strike, the latter bluntly urging the U.S. to kill them all violently. Colombia's president called the killings murder. Brazil's Lula urged peace and, before the United Nations, likened the use of lethal force outside a war zone to executing people without trial. Iran's ambassador in Geneva condemned the strike as a breach of international law. What began as a single missile strike in the Caribbean had morphed into a test of norms that had restrained conflict for decades. But behind the headlines and diplomatic shouting, military planners were asking a far more dangerous question. If one strike could be justified, why stop at one? The world's attention turned from the smoke on the sea to the cold calculus of what might come next. A dangerous precedent. Will there be more strikes? The blast in the Caribbean waterways may have ended one operation, but it opened a larger question. Had the U.S. just set a precedent that would make future strikes more likely and perhaps more dangerous? Across military and diplomatic circles, the strike was being described as a test case, a sign that Washington was willing to use one of its most powerful conventional weapons against a cartel network. The concern spread fast. If a cartel hiding inside a country's borders could now be treated like an international terrorist group, what stopped similar strikes from being ordered elsewhere? Whether in the jungles of South America, in the deserts of the Middle East, or even along coastal drug routes in Africa. The line between counterterrorism and counter-narcotics had blurred overnight, and many feared that it would not be easily drawn again. The cartels themselves were already adapting. Intelligence reports suggested that surviving factions of the Tren de Aragua were shifting tactics, moving away from large jungle labs and scattering their production across urban centers, sometimes in ordinary apartment kitchens. Others were exploring new smuggling methods, from semi-submersible drones that could move drugs beneath the sea to alliances with Haitian gangs, and even whispers of buying drone technology from Iranian sources. These adaptations made one thing clear: the strike had destroyed a hub, not the network. The more the cartels fragmented, the harder they would be to target. This reality fueled debates in Washington and at Southcom headquarters. Military planners pointed to the success of the operation as justification for keeping such options on the table. They argued that the new threat landscape might require follow-up strikes, possibly even deeper penetrating weapons like the 30,000-pound massive ordnance penetrator, if the cartels dug themselves into fortified underground sites. Opponents warned that each new strike risked pulling the U.S. into a cycle of escalation. Every time a bunker was leveled, the cartels would scatter, recruit, and return in new forms, potentially drawing in foreign backers and destabilizing entire regions. They also feared the political consequences, both at home, where Congress was already questioning the lack of oversight, and abroad, where allies worried about the precedent of unilateral cross-border actions. For now, the decision rested on intelligence. Reports from captured operatives pointed to other sites still active in remote regions. The pressure was mounting for Washington to act before those networks were rebuilt. Yet each move risked deepening the cycle, making the next strike seem inevitable and the conflict harder to contain. That unsteady balance between deterrence and escalation would not hold for long. Because even as leaders argued, in the shadows of the Orinoco, survivors of the river strike were already adapting, already plotting the next phase of the war. Ripples of ruin, cartel's last gasp or new dawn. The night the river burned was supposed to be the end. Armed patrol boats tore through the darkness and turned the waterway into a wall of fire. This may have sent the warning to the cartel that the U.S. is watching and they're ready to strike. But will the cartel take the warning seriously and retreat or regroup? For a moment, it looked as if one of the most violent cartels in the hemisphere had been erased. But victory turned out to be an illusion. They did not regroup as an army. They dissolved into the crowd, changing routes, changing faces, and plotting in silence. In the weeks that followed, the war mutated. Roadside bombs started appearing along highways used by U.S. agents. A fresh surge of migrants at the southern border carried cartel members hidden among families, some vanishing into cities as far north as Toronto. Old pipelines flared back to life in suburbs that had been quiet for years, feeding an overdose wave that soon eclipsed the losses from the river strikes themselves. Civilian militias raised checkpoints overnight. Suspicion turned neighbor against neighbor in exchange for food rations, while gunfire punctuated ordinary disputes in the streets. In Congress, hawks hailed the operation as a turning point. Critics warned it risked drawing the entire region into a proxy war. The heaviest cost may be paid by ordinary people. This may lead to trade disruptions and mass displacement, empty store shelves, and deepened hunger. For them, the promise of a clean strike on a cartel fortress became a bitter joke. Yet supporters pointed to the collapse of Tren's old strongholds as proof that treating them as terrorists had finally unleashed the tools needed to hit back. But the strike did more than shatter a cartel's headquarters. It taught every survivor that the rules had changed. No longer safe in remote jungles, they broke into smaller, deadlier cells, hiding labs in city apartments and forging alliances with gangs across borders. The fight had slipped into the shadows. And now, the question hangs in the air like the smoke over the river that night. Did the U.S. cut off the serpent's head or scatter its venom into 1,000 wounds? Somewhere in the dark, those scattered cells are already adapting, already preparing, and perhaps already choosing the moment to strike. What do you think? Should the U.S. go even further, dropping a Moab to crush the cartel once and for all, or stick to lighter targeted strikes to avoid unleashing even more chaos? Tell us your opinion in the comments section below. This war is only just beginning, and the next moves on both sides could change everything. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next chapter, because the battle that decides how far this conflict will go has yet to be fought. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.